Director of Training and Development at the U.S. Agency for Global Media. Most of you in Mongolia know USAGM, as we call ourselves, as the organization that runs the Voice of America. And I'm happy to say that Voice of America is very prominent in Mongolia. We broadcast on some of your stations, and we hope that you listen to us. Today, we're going to be looking at some of the impact that the COVID-19 pandemic around the world has had on the media. And unfortunately, it hasn't been very positive. So let's start from the beginning. And just to note that, pardon me, I'm going to go back. Yesterday was World Press Freedom Day. And World Press Freedom Day is marked every year. It's sanctioned by the United Nations. And it's a day in which we all honor the press. We underscore the importance that the media has around the world in delivering news and information to vulnerable populations, and actually to all populations, because freedom of press is a human right. It is the right of all people around the world to get accurate information about what's going on in their world, in their lives, and in the rest of the world. So, unfortunately, the trends for free media have not been good over the past years. And we have an organization called Freedom House, which is a non-governmental organization in the United States. And it does an annual survey of the state of the media around the world, which means they go all over to every country. They assess where things stand with the media and how things are going. Unfortunately, the media has been on a downward trend, media freedom, not necessarily the media itself, but the freedom of media to operate in an unfettered environment has been declining. And this was marked in 2019 by a downward spiral, according to Freedom House. I'd like to just show you a map of media freedom, and you can see that the dark red areas are the places where media is not free, and the lighter shades of red and pink are the places where media is free. I might say that here in the United States, we've actually seen a decline in our media freedom ranking. And that's for a number of reasons, which we will discuss. But as you look at the map, you can see that your country, Mongolia, is a much lighter shade than the rest of the surrounding countries, namely China and Russia, where media freedom is very much lacking. So let's look at the reasons that media freedom worldwide has been declining. And there's a number of them, but we will highlight 4 reasons that are most important. First, there is a trend among populist leaders to crack down on media. This has taken place in Hungary, where Viktor Orban has very severely cracked down on media. It happened in Venezuela during the Chavez regime, and now we have President Maduro. So basically, populists don't like the media. In our own country, we've seen our president attack the media, for which he has received a lot of criticism. But there haven't been any laws in our country that crack down on the media. It's mainly been talk and rhetoric. A second problem facing media worldwide and in Mongolia is the financial model for media. And by this, I mean that for decades past, the media was supported by advertising. So media content was underwritten by advertisers who supported newspapers, broadcasting operations, various media outlets, they paid to have advertising in these media companies, which would then use money to produce content. That model has been absolutely upended by social media. As many of us know, social media content is widely available. It's free, frequently, and it's caused great harm to media institutions. I read a chilling statistic yesterday about the United States, which said that there are only half as many journalists in the United States today as there were 12 years ago in 2008. And that's primarily because media organizations can no longer afford to pay journalists and to pay a lot of journalists. And of course, that hurts people because we need journalists reporting news, and we need more of them. They need to be specialists. They need to look for what the stories are, and that takes time and money. Third, there have been a lot of new regulations that have been put on the books, including in your own country, where it is now a crime to publish false news about COVID. But in general, many governments, including authoritarian governments, have placed additional restrictions on media. And this has caused problems for the press. I know in your own country, there is a problem with defamation suits. In addition, you have rules on the books which require freedom of information. But I've been to your country, and I know that many government officials do not adhere to the rules that say information should be free. But you're not alone, because that's very common in many, many countries. And finally, there's been a movement to discourage, a political movement to discourage freedom of information. And by this, I mean, there are people who are angry at the press. They don't like the messenger. And in some countries, this has become a political movement of itself. So let's look at Mongolia. Your score in the Press Freedom Index is 73. It has declined 3 points in the last year, 2019, which is the Reporters Without Borders analysis. Again, there are many institutions. We mentioned Freedom House. This is Reporters Without Borders, which is an NGO based in Europe, based in France, and they do an excellent job of monitoring media. They have ranked Mongolia as 73rd. The United States, for comparison points, is 45. But you can see here that Mongolia is much freer than many of your neighbors, but there are still some challenges. Defamation suits are one, the crackdown on fake news is another. A third is a culture of self-censorship, which is often brought upon because many of your broadcast organizations are owned by political oligarchs, by people who have a vested interest in seeing their points of view put forth. So now let's get to COVID-19. And we've set the stage for a world in which media freedom has been deteriorating to some extent. And now we have COVID-19. And unfortunately, this pandemic has been an opportunity for some governments to harass journalists, to arrest them, to practice censorship, to essentially use the COVID-19 pandemic as an opportunity to further harass journalists. I draw your attention to the Committee to Protect Journalists, cpj.org. This is, again, a New York-based organization. They are very good at monitoring the state of media around the world. They have an Asian division, and they encourage anyone who suffers from any kind of harassment to be in touch with them. Okay, I like this map because it's colorful. This is put out by another organization based in London, Justice for Journalists Foundation. You can see the website down below, JFJ.Fund. And what it shows is where there have been restrictions around the world. You can see that some of the clusters have taken place in Nigeria, as an example. There have been some problems, and well, China has had terrible restrictions on journalists, and not just journalists, but also doctors who were among those who were harassed when they tried to initially start to talk about COVID-19. This map's a little out of date. In India, for instance, there have been some recent crackdowns on journalists that have been quite intense. India has always had a very democratic approach towards the press and a very free press, but unfortunately this pandemic is allowing officials to take a harder line against journalists that they don't like. Just a little bit more detail here. Again, I encourage you to go to journalistsforjustice.fund to look at the map to see what's going on a real-time basis. You can see that this story is from April 28th, which is just last week, talking about what happened when some journalists tried to publish a story in China. So now let's look at Mongolia. A recent story. Here's what your government is now doing about fake news. There are criminal penalties for fake news, and we all agree fake news is bad. It's dangerous. It can cause social distress. But the problem is, who defines fake news? So when you actually have government officials deciding what is fake news, you run into a big problem, because essentially you're handing power of the press over to the government to decide what is free press, what is fake news, what causes social distress, what causes economic harm. Those are issues that it really is, in my opinion, and in the opinion of most First Amendment supporters in America, should be decided by the people and not by the government. Again, just some examples of some attacks that have been made on journalists. This comes from Russia, where one of the journalists who worked for the US government organization, Radio Free Europe, was attacked. So where are some of the biggest crackdowns taking place during this COVID epidemic? I've listed a couple over here on the left-hand side. The first is Iran. Iran had a large outbreak of COVID-19, and immediately Iran, of course, has a very authoritarian dictatorship. They went so far as to ban newsprint so that newspapers could not be published. Number two, India. As I mentioned, India has taken some pretty broad measures to try to curb journalists from doing their jobs, including saying that you need permission to report on COVID-19, which is ridiculous. Number three, South Africa. Again, they've banned fake news. In South Africa, there's been a lot of unrest because there have actually been comparatively very few cases of COVID-19, and people are questioning the severe lockdown of the country at a time that there is so much economic distress. So again, it's unclear whether the crackdown on fake news is to prevent the disease or to give government officials more control. We've mentioned Hungary, where the government assumed new powers as a result of COVID-19. China, a terrible situation where journalists are disappearing, where there has been really incredible censorship, and of course, a very strong firewall which prevents Chinese people from accessing sources of information outside China. And finally, I refer to Venezuela, which again has a dictatorial regime, and there have been numerous attacks on journalists in that country. Just another example from Belarus. And that brings us to the conclusion of this PowerPoint. We're going to be looking at some other issues involving COVID-19. One, how journalists can actually stay safe and protect themselves. And secondly, we're going to be looking at some of the ethics around health journalism. So thank you for your participation. You can always email me. Feel free to reach out to me on various social media platforms. And thank you very much for your time.